The spring of 1941 was a season of shadows and misplaced confidence. Across the jagged coastline of the Mediterranean, the Third Reich looked upon the island of Crete not merely as a piece of land, but as a gateway. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier that could either choke the British lifeline to the Suez Canal or provide the springboard for a final, decisive thrust into the oil fields of the Middle East. Adolf Hitler, however, was hesitant. His eyes were already fixed firmly on the vast, looming horizon of the Soviet Union, and he viewed the Mediterranean as a secondary theater, a distraction forced upon him by the staggering incompetence of his Italian ally, Benito Mussolini. The invasion of Greece had been a messy necessity, a rescue mission to salvage the Italian collapse in the Balkans. But as the British and Commonwealth forces retreated from the Greek mainland, they fell back to Crete. For General Kurt Student, the visionary and fiercely ambitious commander of the German airborne forces, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He envisioned a vertical envelopment that would stun the world. He proposed a gamble so audacious that it had never been attempted in the history of warfare, the first large-scale, purely airborne invasion of an island fortress. It was to be called Operation Mercury, a name that suggested speed, divinity, and the fleeting nature of luck. But beneath the surface of this grand ambition, the foundations of the operation were already rotting. The German intelligence apparatus, the Abwehr, was suffering from a systemic failure of catastrophic proportions. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris provided estimates that suggested the island was defended by a mere 5,000 demoralized British troops and a handful of Greek remnants. In reality, the island was a hornet's nest. Over 42,000 well-armed and battle-hardened soldiers from Britain, New Zealand, and Australia were waiting in the olive groves. More damning still was the failure to account for the Cretan people themselves. The German High Command operated under the arrogant assumption that the local population would either remain indifferent or welcome them as liberators from British colonial influence. They failed to realize that the Cretans possessed a warrior culture that dated back millennia. To the locals, the German paratroopers were not soldiers of a new order, but invaders who had desecrated the sacred soil of their home. This intelligence vacuum would lead the elite Fallschirmjäger directly into a slaughterhouse. On the other side of the hill, the British commander, General Bernard Freyberg, held a secret that was both a blessing and a curse. Through the ultra-intercepts at Bletchley Park, Freyberg knew the exact date, the exact time, and the exact locations of the German drops. He knew the Germans were coming from the sky. Yet, he was paralyzed by the need to protect the source of this intelligence. He could not move his troops too overtly without signaling to the Germans that their codes had been broken. He was a man playing a game of chess where he could see his opponent and Apo's moves 5 turns in advance, but was forbidden from moving his most powerful pieces into the optimal positions. The dawn of May 20, 1941, arrived with a deceptive tranquility. The residents of Malum, Chania, and Heraklion awoke to a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate the very earth. Then, the sky blackened. Hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 transport planes, slow and lumbering like prehistoric birds, filled the horizon. Behind them trailed the gliders, silent and ghostly. To the observers on the ground, it was a terrifyingly beautiful spectacle. Thousands of multicolored parachutes began to blossom against the Mediterranean blue. But the beauty was short-lived. As the German paratroopers drifted toward the earth, they realized with a jolt of terror that they were descending directly into the muzzles of thousands of rifles. The systemic flaws of the German airborne doctrine were immediately exposed. Unlike their Allied counterparts later in the war, the Fallschirmjäger were dropped with only pistols and knives on their person. Their primary infantry weapons, rifles, machine guns, and submachine guns, were dropped in separate canisters marked with distinct colors. On the ground, the New Zealanders and Australians did not wait for the Germans to land. They opened fire while the paratroopers were still helpless in their harnesses. Men were riddled with bullets before their boots ever touched the soil. Those who survived the descent found themselves desperately crawling through the scrub, searching for their weapon canisters while under a hail of lead. In the vineyards and olive groves of Malum, the elite of the German youth were being systematically erased. The Green Devils, as they were known, were being slaughtered by men who had been waiting for them in the tall grass for days. The carnage was particularly horrific for the Group West, tasked with taking the airfield at Malum. The initial waves were decimated. Entire companies vanished in minutes. The German commanders, back in their headquarters in Athens, were flying blind. Their radios were smashed, their officers were dead, and the reports trickling back were fragments of a nightmare. General Student, waiting for news of a swift victory, instead received a mounting tally of losses that defied belief. The operation was on the verge of total collapse within the first 4 hours. Yet, in the midst of this tactical disaster, a series of small, isolated events began to tilt the scales of history. At Malem, the defense was anchored by the New Zealand 22nd Battalion, stationed on Hill 107, which overlooked the airfield. The Germans had been unable to take the hill, but the New Zealand commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, mistakenly believed his forces were being cut off and overwhelmed. In the confusion of the night, and without clear communication from his superiors, he made the fateful decision to withdraw from the high ground. It was a momentary lapse in judgment that would change the course of the entire battle. When the sun rose on the second day, the Germans realized the hill was empty. They didn't need to capture it, they simply had to walk up and take it. This gave them the high ground they needed to rain fire down on the airfield below. Despite the field being littered with the burning wreckage of transport planes and the bodies of their comrades, the Germans began to land Ju-52s directly onto the runway, one after another, under constant artillery fire. They were no longer paratroopers, they were a desperate tide of reinforcements, pouring into a tiny crack in the British defense. While the professional soldiers fought for the airfields, a different kind of war was erupting in the villages. The Cretan civilians, men, women, and children, joined the fray with a ferocity that shocked the German invaders. Old men with muskets from the Balkan Wars, women with kitchen knives, and boys with stones fell upon the paratroopers who landed in their gardens. This was not the civilized warfare the Germans expected. They were met with a primal, visceral resistance that ignored the Geneva Convention. The Germans responded with a brutality that would leave a permanent scar on the island. In the village of Condamari and elsewhere, the first mass executions of civilians in occupied Europe took place. The cycle of vengeance had begun. The unsung heroes of the Cretan resistance were not just the soldiers in khaki, but the villagers who risked everything to hide wounded Allied troops or to sabotage German supply lines. They fought with the knowledge that for every German soldier killed, a village might be burned to the ground. Their bravery was a testament to a spirit that no empire could truly conquer. As the German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, arrived in force via the now secured Malem airfield, the weight of numbers began to tell. The British Mediterranean fleet, which had been performing miracles to prevent a German seaborne invasion, was taking a punishing beating from the Luftwaffe. Without air cover, the Royal Navy was a sitting duck. Great ships like the HMS Kelly and HMS Kashmir were sent to the bottom of the sea. The sea, which should have been the British shield, became a graveyard of twisted steel and oil. By the end of May, the Allied position was untenable. General Freyberg was forced to order a retreat across the rugged White Mountains toward the southern port of Sfakia. It was a grueling march through scorching heat and treacherous terrain. Thousands of men, exhausted and broken, struggled over the peaks in the hope of evacuation. The Royal Navy, despite its heavy losses, returned once more to the shores of Crete to pluck as many men as possible from the beaches. But thousands more were left behind to face the long years of captivity or to vanish into the mountains to continue the fight as partisans. The Battle of Crete was technically a German victory. They had taken the island. They had secured the Mediterranean flank. But it was a victory bought at a price so steep that it felt like a defeat. The Fallschirmjäger had been bled white. Out of the 13,000 paratroopers committed to the battle, nearly 4,000 were dead or missing, and thousands more were wounded. The elite corps of the German airborne force had been gutted. When General Student arrived on the island to survey the battlefield, he was not greeted with the cheers of a conqueror, but with the hollow stares of survivors and the stench of unburied corpses. Hitler, horrified by the casualties, famously told Student that the day of the paratrooper was over. He believed the element of surprise had been lost forever. The German airborne would never again be used in a major strategic operation. They would spend the rest of the war fighting as elite infantry, their wings clipped by the blood-soaked soil of Crete. The historical irony of Crete is profound. The Germans won the island but lost the weapon that might have won them the war elsewhere. Had those paratroopers been available for the invasion of Malta or to seize the Suez Canal, the map of the world might look very different today. Instead, Crete became a monument to the limits of military hubris and the power of local defiance. The philosophical takeaway of this conflict is found in the silence that followed the guns. It is the realization that even the most advanced military machine can be derailed by the friction of reality, by a single misinterpreted order, by a failure to understand the culture of the people being invaded, and by the sheer, unpredictable chaos of the human spirit. Crete was the graveyard of the paratroopers, but it was also the cradle of a resistance that would haunt the Axis for years to come. As the sun sets over the Aegean today, the shadows of the olive trees stretch long over the white crosses of the war cemeteries. They serve as a reminder that in the grand theatre of history, there are no clean victories. There is only the heavy price of ambition and the enduring memory of those who fell from the sky into a hell of their own making. The ghosts of Mercury still whisper in the Cretan wind, telling a story of a triumph that tasted like ashes and a defeat that held the seeds of ultimate liberation.